Great, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to Reinvesting in Rural America, New USDA Opportunities to Advance the Country's Electric Cooperatives webinar with RMI. If that's the webinar you plan to join, you're in the right place. And if not, now's your chance to jump ship. For those of you sticking with us, and we hope you all will, we welcome you to settle in as we have a lot of great content to share with you today. As I mentioned earlier, for our agenda, we'll have about 30 minutes for presentation and about 20 minutes for questions at the end. So as you're listening to the presentation, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen as questions arise, and we will answer those at the end of the presentation. Our presenters today are Dr. Uday Varadarajan and Sam Mardell. Uday is a fellow at Stanford's Sustainable Finance Initiative and a senior principal on RMI's Utility Transition Finance Initiative, where he focuses on how financial tools and federal policy can accelerate a just and equitable energy transition. Uday is being joined by Sam Mardell, who is a manager at RMI, also an expert on the application of financial and policy tools to facilitate a just and equitable energy transition, and his work focuses on just transition for coal workers and communities. So please join me in welcoming Uday and Sam. Now over to you, Uday.
Thanks so much, Meredith. And I think the first thing, if we could advance the slide, please. Let me start with the overall objectives. We'll start with the welcome and a check-in question, then move on to start discussing a little bit more about what the IRA really did to align financial incentives for co-ops with clean energy development. And then talk a little bit about how it can create opportunities in particular to lower energy costs for co-op member owners. And then I'm going to hand it over to Sam to talk a little bit more about how RMI's proposed support for cooperatives might be helpful here. We have a program that we call eLab that we're hoping to offer to communities across the country who are looking to take advantage of these opportunities. Next slide, please. So before I start, I wanted to ask everyone who's joining to take a moment and reflect in the Q&A, if you can, your one burning question at the top of your mind. What's the top question you've really got about how co-ops could maximize the benefits of the IRA? What are the barriers? What are the opportunities? What are you thinking about? So I wanted to open up particularly as you think about the content that we're going to go through, where I'd love to see, and hopefully for our Q&A session, what I'd like to understand is where you're at on this topic. So I'm going to pause for just a moment for you to reflect. If you have a question that you'd like to put there, we'll get to them in Q&A, and then I'll move on to the content. And I want to thank you all in advance for taking the time to put your reflections down. We really appreciate it. It helps us direct the conversation, particularly the Q&A conversation at the end. Well, thanks so much. I think we've got a lot of really interesting questions, and we'll start going through some of these questions in greater detail towards the end of the presentation. So we can move to the next slide. I'm going to jump in to talk a little bit about the opportunity. So first of all, for those of you all who are entering this space, let me start with the context of where rural co-ops are at. Rural cooperatives have been a critical part of making the electricity sector work for a large swath of America. They've provided low-cost services to rural America for nearly a century under what is really a unique business model that shares the ownership of the assets with the members who benefit ultimately from the power that's provided. There are 832 co-ops that provide power directly to customers across a large swath of America, serving 42 million people, many of whom live in low-income communities. Cooperatives serve about 92% of counties with persistent poverty. And just to set the stage for cooperatives, most of these distribution cooperatives do not themselves source the electricity or own necessarily directly the transmission that's used to take power and bring it to their communities. There are 64 generation and transmission cooperatives across the country that are still owned by the distribution co-ops, but are themselves the direct owners of the transmission wires as well as the generation that serves these distribution co-ops. Now, G&Ts, generally speaking, historically, have been able to finance infrastructure investments that have enabled them to provide this service with a combination of low-cost federal debt that they were able to source from the Rural Utility Service, USDA's longstanding program, as well as much more recently, debt from lenders who are able to access public capital markets to provide debt for G&Ts. I should note that it's critical to note that G&Ts and cooperatives in general, most of them are structured as not-for-profit entities, and most of them are therefore also exempt from federal income tax. Moving on to the next slide. So I wanted to provide that context because it's critical for understanding a dirty little secret prior to the IRA, which is that before the IRA was passed, the clean energy incentives that we have in place across the United States really just flat out didn't work for rural cooperatives and their customers. Why is that? And indeed, it's not just rural co-ops. If we look at the way that we created incentives for clean energy, most of them were done with tax incentives. That's what the federal government really provided for getting utilities and other electricity providers across the country to really make a shift to cleaner resources for climate and other reasons. But the utilities that own about 80% of the remaining coal, for example, across the country, including just about all co-ops, really don't have, as I just mentioned, they're not-for-profit entities. They don't pay taxes, and they couldn't really efficiently directly use these tax incentives. And when we look at what across the country these utilities could actually build, they could build just about 4 gigawatts of solar per year nationally. And indeed, this is what we see. A lot of these utilities had great difficulty and didn't own very much clean energy because they couldn't do it directly. They had to rely on third parties to own these assets, even though they had a cooperative business model that, if the tax incentives in some way could have worked, would allow them ownership of these assets. That was impossible. Unfortunately, that's not the only problem co-ops in particular face. Storage, renewable energy is very capital intensive. You have to put up a lot of money up front to make clean energy work relative to even fossil assets in the past. And the difficulty is that cooperatives are constrained, as I'll talk about a little later, in how much debt they can issue. And it was very difficult for them to financially manage the very large capital outlays that are needed without, given particularly the outlays that they've historically made and the debt they've historically taken on to build their existing portfolio of assets. As a result, it was often the case that new solar, wind was often seen as a threat to utility revenues rather than as an opportunity, because the co-ops could neither finance them nor necessarily take advantage of tax incentives to do this themselves. And on top of that, cooperatives had fossil capital costs for the assets they had already financed, whether through RUS or through public capital markets, that don't go away if they try to deploy clean energy. Those capital costs persist and stay in cooperative rates. They still have to pay off the debt. The debt was taken on by the members. And finally, as with many other utilities across the country, it is still the case that it's very difficult to permit clean energy, to build transmission, and to interconnect that clean energy to any transmission. And that makes out renewable energy build out rather challenging. So this was the case before IRA. Next slide, please. So what happened with IRA? A lot of these challenges were addressed with a number of different provisions that were targeted at mitigating specifically these challenges. The tax incentive issue was addressed with something called direct pay that allows utilities across the country finally to take advantage of the way that we incentivize clean energy, so that the customers of utilities that before couldn't directly benefit or efficiently benefit from tax incentives now can do so. They can use their low cost of capital directly to build clean energy and still take advantage of tax incentives in a way that wasn't possible before. Now, finally, with storage, there is an investment tax credit that can be taken by cooperatives that allows them to build storage and get a significant reduction in the upfront financing cost because of the investment tax credit. And further, the financial challenges that co-ops can face, as we'll discuss in greater detail, can be addressed by the new IRA program, as I'll discuss in a little bit later. Similarly, with the production tax credit and adders for low and moderate income communities, instead of solar and storage being seen as a threat to utility revenues and potentially being a cost burden on cooperatives and their members, now with these adders, it can be a way to mitigate energy burden writ large across their communities, particularly those communities that have low and moderate income customers. We mentioned the fossil capital costs that don't go away. Now that same USDA New Era program, as well as the Energy Infrastructure Reinvestment Program, can help with some of those capital costs and foster reinvestment in communities that had hosted these facilities. And finally, the Energy Infrastructure Reinvestment Program that I'll talk a little bit about can also offer financing to make transmission, transforming the grid in a way that's much more friendly towards the deployment of clean energy, a lot less challenging to finance. Next slide, please. So let me dive into some of these problems in greater detail and talk a little bit about exactly how some of these programs can work together to make this entire picture knit together. How is it that all of this kind of fits together and works? Well, let me start a little bit to talk about where G&Ts are at across the country. And the point that I really wanted to start with is that G&Ts in particular, cooperatives, the entities that provide cooperatives with the generation transmission services they need, at present across the country generally have a bit too much debt and a little too much equity to invest rapidly in clean energy without ending up having to ask members for what are immediate rate hikes. So why is that the case? I'll mention that generally speaking, a cooperative on average has about 30% equity to overall capital. Well, what does that mean? Well, think about when you get a mortgage from a bank. When you ask for a mortgage from a bank to build a house, the bank, generally speaking, would want, ideally without government support, at least 20% of your costs upfront down on the house as a down payment. Well, the problem is that cooperatives essentially have something of a similar constraint. If they want to build something new, they're going to have to put some capital up front, down up front, but they have limited resources to do that. The difficulty is that the way that cooperatives, ultimately, the way that they actually are able to raise that capital they need to put down is from their members. And they usually do it over time in rates. The difficulty is right now, they've already raised about as much as they can in that capital from their members. And if they need to build out a whole lot of clean energy, they're going to have to, sometimes that'll mean that they'll need to nearly double or triple the size of their balance sheets, the amount they'll have to invest twice or thrice as much as they've invested in their current system. And if they're going to do that, they're going to need more money to put down. And the only way they could do that in principle is either to raise rates or to take on, just as you would with a bank, that 20% down. Well, you can get below that, but you'll pay a lot more in interest. That means that they'll either have to take a debt that's going to be higher cost, or they won't be able to do that build up. That's the problem that they face. Next slide, please. So how big of a deal is this? Well, when you look at utilities across the cooperatives across the country that own the bulk of the remaining fossil energy in the system, we calculate, well, how close are they to that 20% ratio? Turns out that 20% ratio is about the same one that is the threshold between co-ops being able to really affordably finance debt and to be able to continue to get the debt they need in case things go wrong, versus not being able to have that flexibility. And if you look at co-ops on the left-hand side, what you see is a whole lot of them are right near that 20% level. Some are above, some are below, but a lot of them fall close to that threshold. So they don't have a lot of room to add additional debt to their balance sheets to be able to finance a whole lot of clean energy very quickly without raising rates. Now, a lot of these cooperatives, nevertheless, when you look at technical potential, have the ability to finance a whole lot more clean energy in principle and put it on their systems and offset the use of their existing fossil fleet. But this debt constraint, and this is the right-hand side, what you see in red is the extent to which this 20% constraint really makes it difficult for them to achieve both, to really build out that clean energy in a way that reduces rates, that doesn't force them to really raise rates to get the equity. So the financial constraints that I'm just discussing are constraining and blocking a good chunk of the clean energy that could be deployed by cooperatives across the country. This is why it's really difficult for these cooperatives to move to deploy clean energy. Next slide, please. So what does the IRA do to help? So let me start with the biggest piece. Finally, the tax incentives from IRA are available to cooperatives. Now, generally speaking, the opportunity here is that particularly with the investment tax credit, this is a tax credit that is payable pretty close to upfront, that provides a very sizable tax credit to offset the investment costs that a cooperative can make in a clean energy system. And particularly with some adders for domestic content and for placement of the clean energy in energy communities, it's possible that the tax credit, and in particular the investment tax credit available for solar storage and wind if as an option, could allow cooperatives to offset nearly 50% of the capital, up to 50% of the capital cost for a large-scale renewable energy project. And that's true because of direct pay, even if they don't have any federal tax liabilities, which most nonprofit cooperatives do not. Now, it might be still feasible and possible that the production tax credit, which is now available for solar, could be, in fact, even better as in terms of the overall benefit being provided if particular G&Ts in their service territory have great solar resources. And then finally, on top of all of this isn't just about G&Ts. For projects that are smaller, 5 megawatts or smaller, and ones that benefit low-income communities or tribal communities, they can receive an even larger adder that can lead to nearly 70% of project costs being offset by a tax credit that can be paid out within a year of that investment back in the form of a direct pay tax credit. So the combination of these tax credits can significantly reduce the upfront capital costs, at least in the long run, that are needed to make clean energy investment work. Now, that being said, there are some delays here. These tax credits are only payable after an investment has been made. Now, the one other thing I will point out is that in addition to the IRA covering the tax credits for solar and wind for the energy, it also covers potentially tax credits that also have all of these same adders to cover the costs of energy storage to address reliability or challenges associated with putting more variable resources on. Next slide, please. But that's not all that IRA provides. I also want to talk about another program that is particularly designed for cooperatives with this challenge, this financing challenge in mind. The New Era program is a program that is only available to cooperatives, and the definition there is a little bit broader, includes G&Ts, whether or not they have taken RUS financing in the past, and it includes distribution cooperatives as well. This program, through either grants or loans and any type of financial assistance, it has a lot of flexibility from the USDA, can cover an additional 25% of project costs and grants or significantly mitigate the financing needs through direct financing or other risk-bearing mechanisms that the USDA can provide. And just to give you a sense of what this can do, I mentioned that, again, the cooperatives had some challenge in raising additional capital up front. I told you that it's possible that the tax credits themselves can help with that problem within about a year. Well, this program is an even better option in principle. It can essentially displace some of that equity that's needed, providing additional 25% of project costs in the form of equity that can be used upfront to reduce the need for any customer rate increases or offset any potential credit rating impacts of taking on some additional debt to finance these assets. And so if you imagine before IRA, if you needed to build a very large clean energy facility to replace, for instance, existing assets that were being retired, then if you, for instance, it was a big coal plant that had already been retired, you might need a lot of wind and solar to do this. You might, on average, I mentioned that cooperatives only have about $1 billion or two on average on their balance sheets, maybe a few plus or minus a few billion there. This build out would be, particularly with storage, can be as much as a $5 or $6 billion investment in principle. That's a significant shift in the balance sheet of a relatively smaller cooperative, even, or G&T. And it's very difficult for them to be able to find that much cash up front for a clean energy investment to really take full advantage of the IRA without rate increases. And what the new era allows them to do is to get a significant chunk of that benefit in direct grants from the RUS, structured to provide, to sort of eliminate the need for raising cash from their members. There was immediate need to raise rates, and then getting debts from the capital markets, because now they have that money down with help from the government to issue debt. And they can use either the investment tax credit or the production tax credit after that to make the entire process affordable for their customers in the near term and in the long run. So on to the next slide. So in summary, the combination of direct pay tax credits and these new era grants can significantly mitigate these financial challenges that co-ops face. However, there are still some issues. And so in principle, these $9.7 billion in grants from the Rural Utility Service, if they're taken in grants, could provide enough equity for about $39 billion in debt. And if you add that to direct pay tax credits, cooperatives can finance what is effectively the build out of a whole lot more solar, wind, and storage. And in summary, the combination of all of these mean that the emissions reductions that might be possible from the cooperative space can largely be realized. That is, the financial constraints can largely be eliminated. That being said, the timing of these grants and when these grants are available, whether it's the direct pay for the tax credits, if an investment tax credit is used, which may be a year delayed, or for a production tax credit, which, if it is the more cost effective, is paid out as clean energy is produced over 10 years, there is still a need for some financing support to make sure to basically bridge those gaps. And so, for example, there may be a need for bridge financing to make to allow for a cooperative to build the clean energy with probably more capital than it would otherwise need in the long run, and be able to sort of bridge that time delay between when the outlay for building a big facility is needed and when the revenues from either the USDA New Era program or the financing from that program comes, and when direct pay tax credits, whether it's the investment tax credit or production tax credits, are actually realized. So moving on to the next slide. But that's not the only programs that are available that can make this attractive for both G&Ts and distribution co-ops in rural communities. There are a number of other programs that are available to address some of these unique financing challenges and these timing issues as well. And at the top of the list, I just want to flag the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is an enormous authority that's being provided by the EPA that is intended to facilitate the financing of clean energy assets and any assets that reduce greenhouse gases, with a particular focus on supporting low-income and disadvantaged communities, which again, because of the focus of rural energy access, has significant overlap with the service territories for cooperatives. And so this fund is intended to provide and enable potentially a much larger bolus of funding that is available for financing support that can be used to potentially bridge some of these financing gaps. But that's not the only, those aren't the only programs that are available. There are a number of other programs, which I'm not going to go through in detail, that address specific other needs. For example, can help distribution co-ops in particular finance clean energy at all scales. On to the next slide, please. And in addition to these programs, I want to flag another issue, which is that the transition in particular from existing fossil assets to clean energy can have a number of challenging impacts on communities across the country, particularly those that are dependent on fossil assets, small, particularly rural communities that may have a single coal plant or other fossil services that have been the lifeblood of their local economies and their tax base. And for this, I wanted to flag another program. The Department of Energy has a $250 billion program intended to facilitate and incentivize reinvestment, in particular in the energy communities that have been so critical to powering our economy for decades. This program is a loan program that is aimed at enabling redeployment of capital in all ways, all kinds of ways, as long as this redeployment of capital for any purpose ultimately reduces emissions. This program can help finance such upgrades. And this doesn't have to necessarily be, but it can help make it more attractive for these communities to attract both energy projects and projects in the clean energy supply chain, but much more broadly than that, attract economic activity that might be much more broadly relevant. Next slide, please. So to summarize, the Inflation Reduction Act can support renewable energy deployment, but it can also ultimately have a transformative effect, not only for G&Ts, but also for distribution cooperatives and the economy of the many, many counties and communities that G&Ts and cooperatives serve. It can help lower member costs. Ultimately, none of these incentives should move forward unless they can truly lead to reduction in costs for distribution co-ops and their customers. This is a carrot that cooperatives only need to pick up if they feel that it can be beneficial to them. It can reduce the exposure of communities across the country to what have been really historically volatile energy markets by deploying clean energy at costs that can be below what they're currently paying. And finally, unlike in the past, this allows for wealth creation by cooperatives. They have the opportunity not just to buy the clean energy assets from others, but to own them. So I want to turn it over to Sam, who can talk a little bit more about how RMI can help support this transition.
Thanks, Ade. We'll move over to the next slide. And as I mentioned, our team at RMI is really thinking through how we can provide support for cooperatives as these organizations think about ways to maximize the value that can be provided by new programs in the Inflation Reduction Act. And this is really driven by an acknowledgement that while these new programs and modifications to tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act solve a lot of really important financing problems for cooperatives, there are important challenges that still must be overcome. And these are, I think, driven largely by the fact that a lot of this is new. And so we have a couple of examples on this slide. So one is around renewable energy ownership. As I mentioned in the past, before we had direct pay tax credits for nonprofit cooperatives, renewable energy ownership was really challenging or impossible for a lot of these entities. And so working with renewable energy developers to structure arrangements for either direct ownership or PPAs of renewables is new and is a challenge that will need to be worked through. Similarly, I talked a little bit about the need for bridge financing. As cooperatives think about building new projects, new wind and solar and storage developments, a lot of the tax credits and grants provided through the USDA are available near the beginning of the project, but not at the beginning of the project, not when financing is needed. And so cooperatives will need to work through how to secure bridge financing to make sure that they can build projects that are supported by these really large pockets of federal money. Similarly, there's just simply a really huge number of programs available for cooperatives. And we've gone through several in this webinar, but that's not the full story. In the Inflation Reduction Act, but also in the Infrastructure and Jobs Act that was passed over the last summer, there are a number of other programs that target cooperatives, but also rural communities in the places that cooperative utilities serve. And some of these include important demand-side opportunities for building out new industry in places served by co-ops. And so sorting through this really huge pot of financing options is challenging. There are a lot of options, and so thinking through frameworks for how to make decisions about which pieces of financial support to access is a real challenge. And then finally, a lot of this is happening very quickly. Some of the pieces of federal support that are really important and exciting for cooperatives have timelines for applications that are coming up pretty rapidly. And so there will be challenges as organizations assess all of their options and make plans that maximize the use of these different pockets of money. And I'll talk a little bit about one program on the next slide. So the New ERA funding offered through the Rural Utility Service is one program that is becoming available pretty soon. President Biden recently announced that the notice of funding availabilities will open up this spring, and applications will likely be due in Q3 of this year. And so this is the program that offers grants and really low cost loans for cooperatives that are thinking about building out clean energy systems. And so organizations, utilities that want to make use of this financing are going to have to move quickly and think through how this financing can support really major changes to their energy systems and the way they provide electricity. And these are really exciting pieces of money, but the timelines are pressing. Next slide, please. And so RMI's response, for the past 10 years, RMI has provided support through our ELAB program. And our ELAB program has worked with electricity sector actors across the country to facilitate a transition to clean energy. And these actors cover sort of a wide range of different types of entities, including generation and transmission organizations and distribution co-ops, and has worked with these organizations to provide both techno-economic analysis, thinking through the cost of different energy resources, financial and policy modeling, providing technical assistance from the modeling that RMI does itself, but also bringing in partners who are experts in really important topics to these actors, helping with strategy and decision-making support, and especially with multi-stakeholder facilitation, when there are cases where it's really important to bring in different organizations that have like a broad range of experiences and expertise to work together to solve challenges, which may be the case with making use of some of these new federal funding opportunities. RMI has built capabilities and expertise in helping groups work together to form strategy and decision-making that make use of multiple organizations' expertise. And so RMI's ELAB program is able to offer philanthropically funded support that is consistent with RMI's mission goals to facilitate an equitable transition to clean energy, and at the same time is designed to help cooperatives meet their goals and maximize the use of these really exciting pieces of federal legislation. Next slide, please. This just shows the kind of range of organizations that RMI's eLab program has worked with in the past. And this includes many other nonprofit organizations, but also businesses and financial organizations. And those include banks that might help finance energy projects. That includes energy developers, developers of projects that are more on the demand side, that make use of electricity, and that includes utilities, so including generation and transmission organizations and distribution cooperatives. And this is really an acknowledgement that the energy system is complex, and lots of organizations hold expertise and experience that can be useful in forming quality solutions that can maximize some of the opportunities that we're presented with. Next slide, please. So in the next presentation on the opportunity presented by federal policy, it may become clear that we've begun to orient towards a number of challenges or pieces of information that we think can be particularly important to focus on and help provide solutions for as co-ops think of ways to make use and maximize the value of incentives through the Inflation Reduction Act. And I'll walk through a couple of these, noting that we're continuing to build out this set and consider ways to best provide technical information, but also partner and work with G&Ts, distribution co-ops, other organizations that have ideas and expertise in working through some of these challenges. And this includes developing frameworks or really sorting through how to make use of this really big set of financial programs provided by the Inflation Reduction Act and the IIJA to meet co-op needs. So how do you sort through the different options to solve the challenges and meet the strategic goals of cooperatives? It includes maximizing the benefits of the tax credits, which, as I mentioned, can stack to really cover up to 50% of a large project. So how do you work through to understand how to site projects and source material to best make use of the potential? And how do you think about direct pay and partnering with renewable energy developers as you build out new solar and wind and storage systems and other resources? It's understanding different business models and the trade-offs and understanding how to select between ownership of renewable energy and PPAs, some of the financial considerations, but also operational considerations and need for sort of upkeep and maintenance of systems that are new to generation and cooperatives. It's creating ambitious and achievable emissions reduction plans. And the RUS financing in particular, the New ERA program, is asking cooperatives to really put forward ambitious plans and think big about how they can create emissions reductions over the coming decade. So RMI has a lot of experience helping organizations think through how to create achievable and ambitious emission reduction strategies. It's developing robust Justice 40 strategies. The Justice 40 program applies to the Inflation Reduction Act programs, and organizations will need to think through how to structure community benefits agreements and work with the communities in ways that some are familiar, some might be new. And so RMI is thinking of ways to support that work. It's connecting with industrial developers across rural America. Businesses are looking at the Inflation Reduction Act and other bills and understanding really exciting new incentives to create demand-side uses and new industrial developments that could be sited in cooperative service territories and provide economic benefits to the communities that cooperatives serve. And RMI has programs that work with these organizations, doing things like, for example, ammonia production or hydrogen production that can help form connections or help cooperatives think through some of the opportunities there. It's implementing best practices for resource planning and procurement. The programs in the Inflation Reduction Act really imply sort of system planning and thinking through what a generation mix should look like in 10 years. And so RMI has a lot of experience helping organizations think through their resource planning as they transition to clean energy systems. And there are likely more challenges or topics that will emerge. And so our team will be reaching out and seeking feedback on topics that can be most useful to structure trainings around and host conversations about. With that, I'll conclude the presentation portion of this webinar and turn it back to Meredith to lead our question and answer portion.
Great. Thank you so much, Sam and Uday. We'll now have about 15 minutes for Q&A. There have been a lot of great questions already coming in. And now that you've heard the full content of the presentations, we welcome you to continue to chat your follow-up questions, again, using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So I'll read your questions to the panelists, and we'll get to as many as possible during the time that we have available. So our first question for Uday and Sam is, how do rural co-ops access developers, and how do they get developers to be interested in rural installations when it's more expensive to install remotely?
Yeah, I think one of the opportunities that we're seeing here, especially for developers, is that I think prior to the passage of IRA, these service territories, particularly of cooperatives, weren't necessarily places where developers had focused a lot of their development efforts. There are large swaths of the country where it was going to be difficult otherwise to interconnect or otherwise provide service in a way that worked. With the shift in IRA, the possibility of developers actually seeing business models that work for them that would interconnect clean energy, for example, in ways that take advantage of existing interconnection for fossil assets, or provide benefits more flexibly that can be used by both a local cooperative as well as to provide power that might be wheeled to other parts of the country, suddenly becomes much more attractive. And what I mean to say by this is, I think the developers are going to find that with these programs, it's going to be a lot more attractive for them to pursue partnerships with cooperatives directly in ways that they hadn't previously, for example, through co-ownership, bringing equity, et cetera. And so one of the things we are definitely interested in doing, and I'm hearing from your question, potentially real interest, is to start to facilitate some the development of at least some convenings to help do this matchmaking, and to get developers in the same room to engage with cooperatives to start to build those relationships. I will also note that developers so far have been focused, for example, in procuring clean energy or in building clean energy through long-term power purchase agreements with corporates, and that there are one of the things that RMI has done in the past is to build a platform for exactly this kind of matchmaking that we called the Renewable Business Renewable Center, which is now the Clean Energy Buyers Alliance. And so I think there are examples of how such fora can work, where this matchmaking can happen, and we're happy to sort of engage to help sort of facilitate those introductions and help make it happen.
Thanks, Uday. So folks, still feel free to continue to chat your questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Our next question is, how have you found it best or most successful to engage with co-ops who are still learning about IRA opportunities? Either Uday or Sam.
So a number of ways. I think importantly, cooperatives know their systems and they know their communities really well. And so one way that we want to approach this work is through partnership and kind of working with cooperatives to sort through their goals and their challenges, and then help think through how those goals and challenges sort of match and align with the possibilities presented in the programs that are established through the Inflation Reduction Act and other bills. So RMI has a lot of experience and the past few years has been thinking pretty hard about the different financial options and financial challenges for cooperatives and how they can be resolved or addressed through some of these bills. And we're still learning about challenges that still persist. And so having conversations with cooperatives about the possibilities for solving some of their goals through these programs, and really trying to understand whether there are challenges that still persist that need to be worked through creative thinking or other partnerships is, I think, a strong way that we've been attempting to engage with cooperatives.
Great, thanks, Sam. Next question is, how can communities get involved in this process or these processes?
Maybe one way I'll start is, first, it is pretty critically important for communities to reach out to the USDA in this case, and to other federal agencies. Don't delay in doing that. And so one of the first steps is, if you can carve out the time, start that conversation. Secondly, I think a number of different organizations, ours and certainly at our ECA, Sierra Club, others are starting to build materials online like this one. And we are certainly planning on building additional materials to try to help you facilitate that set of conversations. So the first step is to educate yourself. And that's something that I think we're certainly aiming, and a lot of our partners and other organizations are aiming to provide as much as we can in those educational materials. I think it's also critically important, particularly for members, to go talk to their cooperative boards, to their cooperative management, and have that conversation. In many ways, clean energy and the possibility of cost reductions were much more difficult before IRA and were much more contentious. And the hope that we all have is that the conversations that we can have now relative to 9 months ago have the opportunity for win-wins in ways that weren't possible then, and that these may be much more productive and fruitful conversations to have. So, as always, it's first step is going and talking to some of the folks that you've been working with, particularly, hopefully, armed with these new tools that might make a more attractive option, something that can work for everyone, possible in a way that wasn't.
All right, next question is, can you talk about advantages or challenges that co-ops have in accelerating clean energy interconnection, reducing interconnection costs, and accelerating queue processing and transmission development?
Maybe I'll take that on very quickly. The fact that in many cases, G&Ts, to the extent to which they operate their own systems, they have the flexibility to perhaps move a little bit more quickly than other entities may have, like other vertically integrated utilities to some degree with the G&T system. By owning the generation and the transmission system, it may allow you to move more quickly. The supports are more extensive. The fact that you often serve low and moderate income communities may make it possible for you to get tax benefits that are larger than otherwise could be possible for other entities. So truly, we do believe that there are, both economically and from a process perspective, cooperatives could be at a significant advantage. That being said, I don't want to minimize the challenges here. This does include, involve the need to build new relationships with developers. It does need and require significant, as Sam mentioned earlier, a significant shift in the workforce and training. But we hope that there are enough supports on offer that the combination of all of these benefits indeed do reinforce that potential competitive advantage at this point that cooperatives hopefully have after passage of IRA.
Thanks, Uday. Our next question is about eLab. Can you speak to the financial element of eLab? Is it always free, or is there a scale for support?
So we're philanthropically supported to provide a lot of this work and support for cooperatives as they're thinking through using these federal programs. There may be cases where we structure other agreements to provide more intensive support, but for the most part, a lot of our work is philanthropically supported and will be provided free for people who want to make use of it.
Thanks, Sam. Next up, can you talk more about the role of distribution cooperatives as rural cooperatives work to take advantage of the IRA?
Maybe I'll take the first crack at that. I think, number one, distribution cooperatives themselves can take advantage directly of many of these incentives, both to facilitate build out of distributed supply. There are multiple programs, and I didn't talk through in detail the REAP program, but that is definitely another direct support for distributed resource deployment. But in addition, I should note that distribution co-ops also have flexibility to build out infrastructure that can enable clean energy deployment. And so in principle, again, this doesn't just have to be used for solar and wind. It can also facilitate electrification and decarbonization. It can be used to facilitate integration of distributed resources through things like microgrids, et cetera. So there is quite a bit of flexibility in principle and language to allow for one or more of these authorities, not just the $9.7 billion, but the other authorities present, to facilitate financing of a broad range of activities that ultimately can yield decarbonization and cost reductions to customers. And there are roles that the distribution co-op can potentially play, for example, in making ownership of these assets by members directly, potentially more cost effective than it otherwise would be. You can serve as, essentially, because of your direct pay authority, for example, distribution cooperatives might be able to own or at least finance assets that are built by members through providing financing on balance sheet, for example, and ultimately allow that ownership to be transferred over time to their members to build wealth in their communities, whether it's in businesses or by their members. So there are a number of creative ways that these authorities can be used to kind of sustainably build wealth and ultimately, in many ways, in many cases, these can be done by the distribution cooperatives, independent of their relationships to some degree with G&Ts, but also in partnership with G&Ts.
Thanks, Uday. We've got a pithy one here. How do you ensure that cost savings at the G&T level are passed through to local co-ops and cooperative members?
I think that's, I was going to mention, I should have mentioned at the end of my previous answer to the previous question, that it's the other critical role that distribution co-ops play is being, of course, the owners of the G&Ts that they engage with. And I think that it continues to be the case that there is an opportunity for G&Ts and cooperative members to play that active role in working with their G&Ts to ensure that the transformation that's happening in the G&Ts are ultimately providing not just, are ultimately leading to these benefits being passed through to their members. I do believe that this is also a priority, and in the USDA process, ultimately in structuring this financing, it is important for the distribution co-ops to engage with G&Ts as they discuss with USDA how to take advantage of these programs. There's a lot of flexibility that USDA has, and the benefit of that flexibility is there's an opportunity for distribution co-ops to engage with their G&Ts to deploy that capital in ways that actually does make sure that those benefits get passed through. So that's another venue and opportunity for this, for that engagement. But it is coming quickly, so you do need to move quickly to get get up to speed on this and to work with your cooperative and to work with USDA to make sure that this happens as quickly as possible. And ultimately, we're hoping to be here to try to support in that process. The Inflation Reduction Act, and certainly the administration is aligned with this. The Inflation Reduction Act, the name itself implies, and it can't be politically sustainable if it leads to higher rates, or if it doesn't ultimately achieve its promise of delivering on clean energy that truly does mitigate risks and costs for customers. And so I think you'll find a lot of sympathetic ears in trying to make sure that we are all working together to make sure that happens.
All right, I think this will be the last question, given our timing. This is, what opportunities do you see for rural co-ops and EVs, given all our IRA incentives for EVs? We know that penetration of EVs is lower in rural areas, but school districts are receiving incentives for electric school buses.
We know this is something that cooperatives are thinking hard about, both and really driven by all of the incentives, as the question references, in the Inflation Reduction Act for EVs and supportive infrastructure, charging for EVs. And so cooperatives are beginning to work closely with entities like school districts that are thinking about bringing school buses or larger fleets onto their systems. They're also hearing from their members who are interested in buying electric vehicles and other new electrification technologies more generally, and hearing from members of demand for some of these technologies that have new incentives to make them more cost effective. And so cooperatives have a lot of opportunities to work with their members and do system planning that can really support the integration of a lot of these new resources. We know it's something they're thinking hard about, and I think will be a key topic as they proceed with making use of financing to build out their electric systems to support electrification and new demand side uses on the grids that they manage in the communities that they serve.
Thanks so much, Sam and Uday. Thanks to participants for your questions, and Sam and Uday for your thoughtful responses. And thank you all for taking time out of your busy days and lives to tune into this webinar. So the array of programs our speakers have presented on today represent huge opportunities, some of which, as has been spoken about today, need to be acted on really quickly. So they're new, guidance on them is evolving, and they may be challenging to navigate at this stage. So as Sam mentioned, RMI has many support functions planned to help federal funding applicants and their communities access these funds, including trainings and technical and facilitation support. So to that end, please do reach out to our speakers with further questions or to collaborate on these opportunities. A recording of this webinar will be sent to all participants along with a PDF of the slides. And we, of course, welcome you to share that with your colleagues. And our email will also include a link to a survey to understand how we can best support rural communities while they explore these game-changing new programs. So please do fill out the survey when you receive it. And of course, feel free to also share that with others you think that would benefit from collaboration on these opportunities. So thank you very much for joining us and have a great rest of your Tuesday.